don't allow yourself to be destroyed, but you do, if you're a Christian, you remember the great example that we were given, that the person who was destroyed, but said in the process of it, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Hello and welcome to Confessions. I'm Giles Fraser. This is the podcast where I'm joined by an interesting and well-known guest in an attempt to find out what it is that makes them tick. I'm going to try and drill down into their core beliefs to understand better who they are and what they're on about. Today, it's a pleasure to be joined by Sir Roger Scruton, eminent philosopher who's written on an extraordinarily diverse range of subjects, from conservatism to wine to music to green philosophy to sex, aesthetics, housing. There's not much you haven't written about.
Well, there are some fields I have not yet explored, but they're trembling in anticipation.
Well, very good to have you here for Confessions. The place we normally start with our guests is to ask them to say a little bit about their background and perhaps their family background and how maybe their values have grown out of where they've come from. So perhaps you'd say a little bit about that.
Yes, I come from what I suppose is a lower middle class background. My father was born into the working class in Manchester, in the slums, and he never forgot that, nor did he ever wish to betray it. That was his lifelong guide. You know, what was it that enabled his family to live through the Depression? Family of 8 children, 2 of whom died, but and to remain sort of attached to a sense of who they are and where they should be. He conceived in his very, very difficult childhood deep love of England, and that was, of course, common to that generation who went through the Second World War. But he settled ultimately in the south, in High Wycombe, Marlow area, in Buckinghamshire, where he had met my mother in the war, and became a fervent conservationist. So that was one of the things that I absorbed from him. I also absorbed, in another sense, his passionate socialism and class warrior attitude, and very quickly, because of the virulence of it and his antagonism to my going to grammar school and so getting above my station, came to realise that I was on the other side.
You're a class traitor.
Yeah, I was a class traitor. I hated being a class traitor. I loved the working class as much as he did, but I recognised that they were human, just like the middle class, and one had a choice. Did one go up or down? And, for me, aged 14, it was definitely up.
But what about your mum?
My mother was sort of, she was suburban London middle class. She was an orphan, and very brought up by an aunt who was a Plymouth brother.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and it's very strict. She wouldn't allow toys or jokes. She perhaps didn't have the intellect required by jokes, but nevertheless, it was helpful to her to recognise that jokes were evil anyway. And so my mother was brought up in a very intimidating way. And my father, who was a prize intimidator, took advantage of this. So she was very much in the background and utterly sweet, innocent, and somewhat oppressed person.
I mean, it seems to me already the way in which you particularly describe your father, the sort of the idea of solidarity being, working class solidarity from Manchester, but that idea of solidarity and the importance of solidarity, of the we, is something that's very prominent in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's not just the we; it's the search for home. The Heimkehr, as the Germans put it. That has been a motive in my life, partly because our family was unhappy because of my father's unhappiness, and it was blown apart really by that. So that as soon as I'd got my place in Cambridge, age 17, I left. I ran away to London and didn't ever really go back, except when my mother fell fatally ill with cancer, and I went back to look after her. But it was a very, very difficult time for me.
Did you feel, deracinated in some way? I mean, if you're the story is a story of movement from Manchester to High Wycombe, and then out of your class, as it were.
Yes.
If that's...
Oh, I was deracinated. That's absolutely true. But like so many people, of course. Interesting enough, I've just been in Paris, where I went to a meeting of a sort of little group within the Republican Party there, called Le Sens Commun, who want to rebrand the French centre-right as conservative. So they invited me to give a talk about this. And I spoke to them about Simone Weil, the French philosopher who wrote the famous book published after her death, L'Enracinement, the need for roots, we describe it as. And it went down incredibly well. And there were so many people there for whom that book is still important. And the idea of enracinement is, I think, going to be, you'll see more and more the point to which French right-leaning people will turn. And I came across this book when I was a teenager and was deeply impressed by it. And I suppose that has been something that has guided me ever since.
And so, if you're often described as you have been described as a paleo-conservative. I guess that's what the Americans would describe you as. But that has a sort of that always brings to mind to me the whole idea of a sort of conservatism of place and rootedness. And
yes, that certainly is there in my thinking. But I'm very, I think, unlike the ordinary English conservative. First of all, in having come to conservatism by a path which is essentially bohemian. I was a wanderer, and I became a conservative only when I was 21, in my encounter with the 1968 in Paris. That was
your road to Damascus.
Yes, and it was de Gaulle more than anybody else whom I felt typified the thing that I would want to put in the place of the radical left, who were dominating things then as they dominate things now.
So give me the Roger Scruton view of conservatism in a couple of minutes. Can we do that?
Okay. I've tried. It's interesting you should ask that, because I've tried to give it so many times in my life, and when I've done it, and it comes out in hard covers, and I turn over the pages, I think, no, that's not it at all. It is, of course, an attempt to articulate the search for home and for roots, and to reconnect to the inheritance of culture, law, religion, and being together, all that. But in my case, it also involves a definite move against the socialist norm. Although I'm not a free market fanatic or anything like that, I do esteem individual responsibility in a sort of Enlightenment way. And I think that it's through taking charge of one's life and looking after one's responsibilities as they occur in the course of that life that one really lives properly. And that means getting away from the dependence on the state and rediscovering the forms of social order which grow from below. So that, and in that sense, I'm a bit like a classical liberal, and yet, of course, because of my essentially, I suppose, intellectual approach, I esteem all kinds of cultural products which play no role in the politics of conservatism.
So there's a tension there, or there may be a tension there, to me, between the classical liberal and the conservative.
Yes.
One being focused on individual responsibility, often expressed in terms of human rights and all of that sort of stuff, and then the sort of
and the community
and the
thing.
communitarian type of Roger Scruton.
Yeah. Well, I think that one has to reconcile these things. For us, we are heirs to the Enlightenment. You don't go back from something like that, and I agree with Kant. It is the time of mankind's majority, when we finally take full responsibility for our lives and don't lay the burden of it at God's doorstep. It doesn't mean that one doesn't accept the ultimate sovereignty of God, but still life in this world is a life that is for us to lead through our own choices. And that Enlightenment view means that I think one steps back from putting religion in the place of in the central place of community building, and tries to find all those other networks through which people are reconciled to each other and live side by side. And I think that's a great achievement of Western civilization, that we've done that. And Islam has found it very difficult to do that.
Islam places God much more centre stage in community building.
Yeah, and indeed submission to God's will is the premise from which communities are supposed to flow. And that makes it very difficult, of course, for Muslims to live side by side with those who don't accept that premise. We find it a bit easier, but of course, like them, I very much regret the sort of atheist culture that has grown as a result of the Enlightenment. And I can understand entirely why they feel not just threatened by it, but polluted. That those human relations, which ought always to have a God-acknowledging part to them, like sexual relations, are sort of cleansed completely of that in our society today. And the result is offensive to Muslims, and ought to be more offensive to us than it is.
I find, it's not something you're allowed to say, or you're not supposed to say in sort of liberal society, I guess. But I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. My wife is Israeli, but I spend quite a lot of time in other parts of the Middle East. And I find myself feeling extremely comfortable in a Muslim society.
Yes.
I lived in the Yemen for a while, and I sort of loved it. And I feel, it's not that I share the values so much. It's just that strong sense of togetherness under God, which you say is a part of the Enlightenment that that moved away from. But I find that.
I agree. It's the piety and the courtesy that comes from piety, the recognition.
I think that's exactly right. I rather love that, really.
Yes.
And,
no, I agree.
You're often sort of one of the things that's said against you is that you have a problem with Islam. It's just one of those, it's one of those things that's thrown out and so forth.
Yeah.
So I'm quite glad to hear you say that, because
I only have the problem that everybody has, which is that every now and then people, Muslims, are prone to commit crimes in the name of their God. This is, one wants to think this is because they've misunderstood what the commandments of that God are. But of course it is something which we can't turn away from, that there are ways of understanding Islam which become a threat to all those who don't accept the premise.
But there is a way in which Islam plays a role in our society as a sort of rallying point for a certain sense of, we stand... for conservatives, it used to be communism, and now it's Islam, and there's a sense in which you're rallied to some, sense of purpose by these two things.
By casting Islam as the enemy, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, I'm not sure that is really true of British conservatism. I don't think it's ever been that. People have reacted negatively to those aspects of Islam to which one should react negatively. The fact that there isn't that self-correcting, self-doubting, open discussion that all Christians have about their faith. And one needs that in this particular moment. Everybody recognizes this, and how to achieve that is, of course, a great question. One won't achieve it by confrontation. One will achieve it perhaps if one can open the dialogue somehow. And it's a very complicated question, this. The invention of the category of Islamophobia has not helped. The idea that if you have doubts about Islam, that this is a kind of phobia, like xenophobia, some kind of pathological state of mind. And I totally reject all that. I reject the whole way in which political discussions now have lapsed into name calling, just taking labels and sticking them on people. This is how the Nazis and the communists worked, and look what they did. They set they placed a kind of bomb in the middle of society and then blew it up.
I completely agree with you about that culture of denunciation we have, but there's a little part of me which I'm still not convinced against Islamophobia, insofar as I am convinced there is such a thing as anti-Semitism, and that there is and that there does seem to me to be a number of parallels between what we call Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Is that a mistaken?
I think it is, because anti-Semitism, for a start, is condemning people on the grounds of their genetic origins, and that's how it's understood.
So there's no genetic origins to Islam.
No, Islam is a faith, and it's a faith which contains whole sections that we can accept. That anybody would accept, and also other sections which are open to discussion, and some which I think it would be quite reasonable to reject. And that's true of all faiths, probably. And the invention of the word Islamophobia it coincided with the moment when people really wanted to raise these questions. And that was an attempt to stop them doing so, to stop discussing, what it is about Islam that makes it possible for someone to murder 3,000 people in the name of Allah. That's a perfectly reasonable question.
It is.
And all Muslims have got to face it and give us their answer. And my Muslim friends are perfectly clear about it. They give their answer, and it's the one that I want.
Can we just return to this this question that I just asked you before about the reconciling the sort of the Enlightenment I part of your thinking,
yes,
and the conservative we part of your
yes,
thinking? And I guess I want to. I imagine part of the role that Hegel plays in your thinking is that Hegel allows a sort of a dialectic, as it were, a way of bringing things that look like they're opposites into some sort of, into some sort of common space.
Yes.
Is that part of the appeal?
It's part of it, actually, definitely. But there's more to Hegel than that's relevant to what I think, namely that he inherited from Kant the idea of the free individual subject as the centre of one's world. But he also argued that you aren't born as a free individual subject. You become that, and you become it through your relations with others.
Yeah, network of relationships.
And through contest. And this contest is a complex, deep archaeological process, archaeological layer, rather, in our psyche. The famous argument that he gave about the master and the slave, which was not about telling us that we all are masters or slaves, but that this contest between the master and the slave is something we go through, all of us go through in the course of our development. And if we haven't gone through it properly and have not emerged with the idea of reconciliation through mutual recognition, then we haven't really obtained our freedom fully.
You might have to explain very briefly the master and the slave to those people that are listening that have never come across it.
It's a complex argument, but the basic idea is you imagine a state of nature in which people are in competition for the things that they desire and need. They fight. And the fight is to the death because there is no alternative offered to them. They haven't got yet to the stage where they can discuss this matter. One of them finally, the one who values his own life more than his dignity, surrenders and then becomes slave to the master. But that master then uses this slave in order to enjoy the products of the earth. And how can he do that? Only because the slave is involved in producing those things. And through producing, the slave imprints his nature upon his surroundings, becomes conscious of himself, and gains a half of freedom, namely the half that is self-consciousness. And that enables him, in due course, to rise up and enslave the master. And this process goes backwards and forwards until finally the solution is, as it were, emerges by an invisible hand. And the solution is to recognize each other as free and confer that freedom on each other, and thereafter to engage in one's life through agreements and compromises.
Very interesting. It sounded, to start with, when you first start talking about this, it sounds like Marx, and then it slips into Adam Smith.
Well, there's a shared agenda between all three thinkers, it has to be said.
That's extraordinary.
And Marx's early writings are simply commentaries on the master and slave dialectic. Anyway, I've always taken that argument to heart and recognized that while we esteem individual freedom, and rightly, and because without it we're not taking responsibility for our lives and for the people around us, while we esteem that, we can only enjoy it because we have also accepted our membership of a larger world and a larger community.
And then you take that master-slave argument, and then that gets translated into the realm of economics as well.
Yes, into economics and the family. Perhaps because my family was so dysfunctional, I've always esteemed the family as the thing to which one must aspire and which one must try to obtain. And it could be said that I didn't obtain it through so much of my adult life, and I only, in my second marriage, which was my only successful marriage, occurred when I was 50.
Do you have it now? Do you have that? What you're looking for?
Yes, of course. Insofar as someone with an inadequate nature like mine can have it. I recognise that if I don't have it completely, it's because of the faults that I've acquired through my through fighting against things too much.
Oh, right.
But yes, I mean,
you're a casualty of the battles that you fought.
Well, you don't emerge from life without scars, or if you do, there's something wrong with you. But yes, I have had quite a lot of battles.
And you've been having them recently as well.
Yes, I've had. I've been having them in the sense that people have been fighting me. I haven't fought back.
Okay.
I'm a hate figure for a certain kind of half-educated, politically correct person. Yeah.
I think it's worth us just having 1 minute at least to talk about this, because some of the things that you've been accused of was the Soros comment about that it was a comment of that grew out of some sort of anti-Semitism in you,
yes, that was true. Because, but if you have one sentence taken out of a speech, which actually was about how difficult it is for Hungary to have a rebuild the nation state because of the legacy of anti-Semitism. I was actually saying the opposite of that, and how this has come to a fore because of the Soros network and the way in which that has collided with the programs of the government and so on. I said things which, if you take one sentence out of context, someone might say that's anti-Semitic, or because you have to look at it in context. It's so obviously not. But there's a sort of malice about this way of sifting through speeches and writings to find a sentence which, when deprived of its context, can be turned into an accusation. And it shows a total degeneracy in the standards of public debate in this country.
Have we lost a generosity of interpretation?
Well, or even an ability to interpret, because people don't read. There's this peculiar person who happens to be a Labour MP and even a front bench spokesman who was provided with these snippets from things I had said in order to create a case against me. But when asked on the radio, had you read this speech? He said no. He'd read this one sentence, which in context is completely harmless. But what can one do? My feeling is that when subject to these attacks, first of all, you should remember it's only right-wing people who are subject to this kind of attack. Nobody would dream of doing this to an ordinary left-wing thinker. The thought being that that somehow we are legitimate targets. But when subject to this kind of attack, you have to remember that there is a larger context in human nature. That you're not there because you've said something that somebody is objecting to. You're there because of who you are. You're there like Oedipus under his accusers. Someone's going to accuse you of incest, like as Marie Antoinette, for instance, was accused, or of some similar pollution, and it's you who are the object of attack. You are the scapegoat, and this is a standard feature of the human condition, that when people who live in a state of inner conflict want to objectify that conflict by finding a target and destroying him. And that's what I recognised. This has happened. And what do you do then? You don't allow yourself to be destroyed, but you do, if you're a Christian, you remember the great example that we were given, that the person who was destroyed but said in the process of it, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And I think that is absolutely right, that the scapegoat mechanism is there in everybody. Everybody wants to, when troubled, to find a target and destroy it. And if you happen to be that target, you've got to remember that example if you're a Christian, or remember, if you're a Muslim, all those passages in the Quran where you are told to speak peacefully to the ignorant. I know this sounds a bit moralistic to say it that way, but I don't think you can respond in any other way, because scapegoating is a fundamental part of the religious experience. It has a religious origin and a religious solution. So it's there you should look for the solution, not by fighting back or anything like that.
That sounds like Girard.
It is Girard, of course. I'm influenced very much by him.
Great thinker.
Mm.
Can I talk to you a little bit about capitalism and money? Just a little bit about that, because though I share quite a lot of your, in a way, I share quite a lot of your conservative instincts, being religious, family, place, a lot of those instincts I share. But I see one of the things that destroys that rather than enables it to flourish is a sort of overvaluation of the market. And it's always puzzled me that conservatives are so enthusiastic about the greatest change agent the world has ever known, which is capitalism, and how those two things come together.
It is a great question. I mean, it is the question of our time in many ways. And I think one should take a long view of this. The word capitalism came in with Saint-Simon, I think, and it was picked up by Marx and made into a kind of, it was sloganized. It was made into a description of a system. And the idea is that this is a system in which grips people and has a kind of identity of its own. It's going on churning out its results without any human interference. And we need a rival system, and so we get the capitalism versus socialism thing, which is in itself extremely misleading, because capitalism is not a directed system. It's not even as Adam Smith wisely says, it arises by an invisible hand. It's a byproduct of our free choices and not itself a thing that's chosen, whereas socialism is completely the opposite of that. It's not a byproduct of free choices. It is something which is itself chosen and then constrains our free choices. Both of them have huge defects. Capitalism has the great advantage that it seems to be constantly generating wealth. It doesn't distribute it very fairly, that's entirely true, but it does generate it. Socialism, which is determined to distribute wealth fairly, seems to fail to generate any wealth to distribute in the first place. So there are real problems here as to what position one should take. And I'm sort of basically persuaded by what has become the norm in Western societies, that of course you have to have a free economy, because otherwise people have no incentive to produce anything. But the products of that free economy can't be simply distributed by the people who produce them. We must have other mechanisms for looking after those who don't or are incapable of producing something, or for some reason are pushed to the margins. Exactly what those processes should be is a real question. I think putting too much emphasis on a redistributive state is dangerous, because then the people who are charged with redistributing things, the bureaucrats, they do indeed redistribute things, but to themselves on the whole. They create the privileged liberal elite, which gets all the rewards, and then that leads to the kind of the Brexit situation, where the ordinary person finds that indeed everything has been redistributed, but he hasn't got anything. We should work much harder on the spontaneous ways in which people do look after each other, redistribute their benefits, and also live properly in an attitude of generosity. And that is where the consumer society attaches people far too strongly to their material products. And I think we need to, calm down a bit.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah.
Especially as your new interest in housing, not new interest, but your,
I've been,
you've been interested in it for a while,
yeah.
But your new role in. So as you know, you've been to my church at the Elephant and Castle. You played the organ. You played carols.
Yeah.
But so in the Elephant and Castle, it was obviously flattened after the war, that
Yes.
area, and then there were sort of big estates that were put
Yes.
up that were ugly, brutal, eventually dangerous because people didn't invest in them. They did have a sense of community about them, but they were still tough
Yeah.
places to live in. These have now been pulled down, and in their place, very expensive tower blocks have been put up that actually local people don't live in, that are often owned by people living in China or in Singapore, And so my parish is often full of flats where the lights never go on. Now, for a Conservative to want to talk about, community and all those sorts of things, I don't know how I'm the vicar of a community in a place where the lights are never on.
I think the problem that you've raised here is not one problem. There has been an irresponsible attitude to ownership that has developed partly as a result of the European Union, which does not regard land as in any way special. It's just a capital asset like anything else. So it can be owned by anyone. It can be owned by someone who's not a citizen of the country and who never visits, etc.
So it's just become a commodity.
Yes, and that, I think, is deeply alien to the Conservative worldview. The land belongs to the people whose land it is. And this was embodied in the English law. The land belongs to the sovereign, who grants leases on it to his subjects. But that has gone largely because of the European Union, and it means that anybody can own anything anywhere.
Tell me how it's gone because of the European Union.
Because of the three freedoms: the freedom of movement of labour, capital, and land, and the freedom of assets, land being one of them. So that these freedoms enable any citizen of the European Union to own a piece of land anywhere in it, but it also has opened the door to people from outside the European Union owning bits and pieces, like the Russian mafia owning whole chunks of London. And if you were a member of the Russian mafia, you would, because there's no point in living in Russia, in that country where your rival mafiosi are likely to bump you off at any time. So we are havens for the criminal elites of the rest of the world. How to stop that is a great question. I'm not saying that there is an easy solution.
Was Brexit partly an attempt to stop that?
Well, it wasn't an attempt, because it was a cry from the depths. Let's face it. But it connects with the problem that you're referring to. After the war, there was a huge housing shortage because people were coming back from the war. That a lot of properties had been destroyed, and all the rest. And it was natural that the government felt obliged to provide housing for people who without it, especially those who had given everything for the salvation of their country. And it was not just in England this occurred, all across Europe. Unfortunately, this coincided with the modernist takeover of the architectural establishment, and that's particularly exemplified by Elephant and Castle, where the Smythsons took over the whole reconstruction of the place, and they were imbued with the Bauhaus ethos, which was an ethos produced by elite people in Germany in the wars who didn't have to live in the things that they were building. And
machines for living in.
Yeah, exactly. And it caused we're still living with the legacy of that. First of all, the destruction of the East End of London. Okay, bombing did a bit of it, but much less than the local councils have swept everything away. Beautiful Georgian streets that could easily have been rehabilitated and which were capable of containing far more people per hectare than the things put in their place. But it all went in a certain direction, and we're now suddenly facing up to this because we've got to build a lot more houses, and the ordinary person is objecting to the kind of houses that are built. So what are we going to do? So as you see, the problem has a social aspect, an aesthetic aspect, and a political aspect, and it's not going to be solved just like that.
And are the sort of glass boxes that are becoming ubiquitous in London, are they a sort of just a reinvention of that machines for living in type of philosophy?
We have to see. if you're struggling to find somewhere to live, and suddenly someone gives you a glass box to live in, you're going to say yes.
Of course.
But in 10 years' time, when the joints have begun to loosen, and the staircases are polluted, and and the criminal gangs are living in the various stories, etc., you won't feel the same. And there's a real question, therefore, as to whether, first was the question as whether high-rise buildings are going to be the solution at all. What is interesting is that above the third floor of any high-rise building, the majority of tenants will be housing association or some other form of social housing tenants. People don't voluntarily live in those sort of buildings, and that's so there are real questions, and not enough research has been done as to what people really do want, and
it can't. I mean, like you say, research needs to be done, but it can't be rocket science.
No.
I mean, that people need space. They need a bit of outside space.
Of course, that's right. But for instance, what was not realised by the Bauhaus type modernists was that that people actually need streets. The street is the most important part of the public arena for most people. It's where they meet each other. It's where and it's from the street that they see the house and get a sense of that they're part of a larger community. A high-rise block is not a community, and people don't necessarily even know who is their neighbour.
No.
So that these are really interesting questions where they touch on something which has concerned me. I mean, the second book that I wrote. The first book I wrote from my heart, actually, was the Aesthetics of Architecture, which was my attempt to address what my father felt most deeply about, which was the ruination of the urban.
Did he live in
fabric.
Tenements? Was he a sort of tenement type of?
We started off in a little semi-detached post-war rubble house, but graduated to a Georgian terrace, and that was his great achievement. But yes, I felt very strongly about this, and that book that I wrote then, and it was published in 1979, that has remained in print ever since.
There's sort of your critics might say there's a bit of Prince Charles about all of this, which is a sort of a sort of overestimation of sort of Georgian, and that it might sort of look a bit like a pastiche if it.
This is the normal criticism that's made. But that is again part of the name-calling culture, isn't it? I mean, it's people refusing to discuss an issue, and and using Prince Charles as another label.
I was just trying to introduce it that way, but I mean, in a way, the substantive issue is that. I couldn't think of anything lovelier than living in a Georgian vicarage. It would be the most beautiful. But when someone starts to build sort of copies of them, there is something sort of toy townish about them.
That is said, and it depends on the kind of copy.
I see.
Architecture is different from all the other arts in that you are compelled to look at it. You're not compelled to look at Tracy Emin's bed, for instance, or to listen to the latest piece by George Kurtak. You can get through life without being invaded by those things, but you can't get through life without being invaded by the buildings around you. So it does really matter how they look to everyone, and people have a sense of what looks nice and what does not. And this is one reason why architecture is so bound up with imitation. It isn't new. The Romans imitated the Greeks and were imitated in due course by the Gothic architects of the Middle Ages, and at the Renaissance, people went back to imitating the Romans again. There's never been a radical break until the modernists, and we're living with what they did, and we know that what they did was wrong, because it has produced alienating cities from which people flee. And we don't necessarily think that everything they did was wrong, but they did something wrong, and that's really what the problem that we have to confront.
So your attitudes to architecture grow out of your deeper conservative principles?
Yes, or deeper, I would say out of my humanity. My conservative principles are another expression of that. And of course, the critics of conservatism always want to brand it as somehow an inhuman thing, that it's all about defending oppression and class distinctions and so on. But my view is that, properly understood, it is a humane vision of the world.
Yes, I mean, I get that right up until the point where I know you've said that you think capitalism has become a sort of, well, it's become a boo word, and it was. But the way in which market forces, and you talk about how they generate wealth well, but they also open up this huge gap between
between rich and poor. Yes,
and I mean, part of my anxiety is actually about relative poverty. So absolute poverty, I'm sure, is addressed through capitalism, but relative poverty should be a sort of a challenge to a one nation type of vision.
I know it is.
When when I was a vicar in Warsaw, in an outer city council estate, desperate place, and the connections between that place and London, where I live and love, is just there's no one nationness about this at all. No. These are different planets.
Well, I would say about that again, one must make comparative judgments. Is it better under another system, and if so, what system? I was always impressed in the old days, in the Cold War days, by the fact that a general in the American army was paid something like 5 times as much as a private. In the Soviet army, he was paid 250 times as much. Wow. Because their control was what determined how much you were paid. And this is still true in Russia today. The rich in Russia are not just rich, they are super rich, and their money is not kept in the country, it's kept elsewhere, so it doesn't benefit anybody in that country either. I'm in favour of there being rich people, provided they spend it all the time on employing others and giving them the chance that they are looking for.
We're supposed to be savers, aren't we? I mean, that's what
ordinary people should be savers, but the rich, when they've got to the stage where they don't need to save anymore, they've got to throw it away. And that's what, it's difficult to say what Christ said about this, that it's easier to pass through for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But as soon as you look at it, of course that's true, because when you enter the kingdom of heaven, if you ever get there, you haven't got any possessions anyway. Possessions are here to use in this earth, and to use wisely, but also generously, and throwing them away is as good a use as anything else.
Would that be a good argument for having sort of greater inheritance tax?
No, because a greater inheritance tax, in my view, is a huge mistake. It takes away, first of all, from people the motive to get wealthy.
Throw it away, you say, though.
Yeah, but throw it away when you've got to a certain stage.
Right.
But one of the motives is, of course, to provide for your children. But it's not only that; it's economically a mistake. The money that's confiscated at your death, if it was given to your children, they would use it much more wisely than the state, and they would use it to do things which will produce a regular income through taxation, whereas the state will just lose it. And I think this has been proved by comparative studies. Anyway, that's another issue.
Is the current Conservative Party conservative?
Well, it contains quite a lot of conservative people, and I think Mrs. May is, in her instincts, is conservative. Obviously, she's in a very difficult position at the moment, but there were plenty of conservative people in the old Labour Party. Someone like Frank Field, or Maurice Glassman. These are all that movement, the Blue Labour movement, is probably more in keeping with my kind of conservatism than most of what goes on in the Conservative Party.
That's probably where I'd situate myself.
Yes,
actually.
but that's conservatism isn't a party political thing for me.
Well, I have to say it was fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for
you're welcome.
for going through all of that. That was much fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.